When the survey ship Dalkini first discovered humanity itself, it was of great surprise that anything lived in this area. Many believed that this was kind of a dead zone, as they only discovered gas giants and things of that nature, and other planets that were completely uninhabitable. However, for some reason, humans, as we found out they were called, had expanded beyond their own sector, but just barely. They had begun to colonize other planets outside their own solar system so that they could just keep expanding. However, when the Dalkini first showed up, they didn't realize that they had been monitored the entire time they had entered the sector. It wasn't long before several ships from several different colonies began to approach it. These ships varied in size from something as small as a little patrol ship all the way to our biggest battleships. However, the Dalkini, being a long-range survey ship, was quite large as it needed to have enough provisions to sustain the crew for its entire journey. When the Dalkini's captain contacted the lead ships, they were immediately told by every single one of the ships that they had entered sovereign human territory, and they were not welcome here. They were offered to turn around and leave, and would be escorted out of their territory. Of course, the survey ship decided that this would not be something they would take seriously, as they seriously outmassed anything that these humans could bring to bear. It wasn't long till they realized that these were not the only ships, as many, many more ships showed up, many with simply passive sensors, and listened to the conversation of many of these human captains as they continued to relay their warning to leave human space. When the Dalkini decided that it would simply power through and continue its survey, the humans had a little surprise for them. Instead of firing on the ships, they docked with the ship, in many cases busting the bow of their ships right through the bulkheads. Then dozens of human soldiers in their massive mechanical armor would flood through the ship. The crew of the Dalkini originally used their automated guns to fire into the humans as they rushed down the corridor. However, this didn't even seem to slow them down, even though they could see that several of the shots had penetrated the metal armor, and there was barely a flinch as these bipeds kept running through the corridor. Then they started to seal the bulkheads. As the humans reached the bulkheads, they pulled out these strange devices on the ends of their weapons. The devices began to glow in some strange color. Eventually, they would figure out these were monomolecular cutters, and they would make short work out of any doors that were in the way. Eventually, the humans got to the bridge and seemed to stop at the bulkhead, seemingly not wanting to cut it. Looked up, and through their translator, they simply said, "Open up." The captain replied back that they couldn't because the outside was no longer pressurized. The humans realized this, seemed to contact their others, and use their own ship to pressurize outside the ship's bridge. Then, they simply walked in. The leader of the humans walked straight up to the one he perceived to be the captain. The captain looked around at each of the humans and was surprised that each of the armors was of similar shape, as in 2 arms and 2 legs. However, each one was slightly different color schemes, different symbols on them, which he didn't know if that indicated rank or authority or whatnot. Some of them seemed to have extra appendages on the back. These seemed to be automated, as there's no way a tendril could fit in those. The captain was shaking in her boots as she realized that these bipeds could easily rip her apart as they cut clean through the bulkheads on the way there. However, took special care not to cut the one to the bridge, and this confused her. The one in charge verified she was the captain and then said, "You don't listen very well, do you? We said, get out. Get out of our territory and don't come back. Do you understand us now?" As he raised his weapon ever so slightly towards her. She acknowledged, and the humans simply looked at each other, seemed to be conversing inside their helmets, though what could be heard inside the bridge room was barely that of a whisper, as the sound did not travel through the armor very well at all. Without much of a word, they all simply turned back and slowly walked back to their appropriate ships. As they were there, they radioed to the captain and reminded her she might want to seal her bridge. With that, the bridge was sealed, and all the ships that had busted through simply pulled away. Though they had left gaping holes in the survey ship, the human ships were barely scratched. If anything, you could simply see long marks from where the metal had scratched into the paint. Aside from that, they simply pulled back away and waited. The survey ship did not waste much time as it turned around and headed back the way it came. The humans monitoring it and following it all the way out of their sector, but as soon as it reached the edge of their sector, they stopped. The FTL engines, of course, were still intact as the humans had no interest in their technology. However, the humans had simply watched it disappear off their sensors. Upon their return, they gave the information to the Council of Five, the Council of Five being the 5 strongest sapient species in the known galaxy. They were the ones who commissioned the ship to go and survey the area, as they were planning on putting in a type of interstellar highway system. However, to do this, they would need the survey ships to go in and map the area very, very well, leaving quite literally no stone unturned, to make sure that as they put in these new relays, which would basically jump a ship from one point to another damn near instantaneously, they need to make sure there was nothing in the way. No extra gravity fields, no extra magnetics, no asteroid fields or anything of that nature, anything that could destroy the ships, as this would be a massive project. Hearing about this unknown species that had simply swarmed a single ship and forced it to turn back under force of arms was enraging to the Council of Five. However, they initially started with a diplomatic route, as they sent another survey ship, but this time would be transmitting out as soon as they hit what they believed was the border of human territory, calling out to the humans that they wished to talk. The survey ship would not stop at the border, but instead just make its presence known as best as it could. This worked very well. However, the humans did not have to wait until it sent out its signal at the border. No. Instead, they were waiting just outside their borders. This was noted as humans expanding their territory, or maybe it had already been this large and they just didn't understand it right. However, the humans themselves were not interested, especially when the aliens decided to show their plans on where the relay would go and what planets would have to be actually removed. This enraged the humans to absolutely no end, as 3 of their planets would have to be completely annihilated for this to happen, to include one in what they called the Sol sector, Sol 3. This was a non-negotiable. They said the planet was incredibly important to them, but never told the aliens that it was their home planet. The Council of Five went back with this information and had to make a decision. If the humans would not let them go through with this plan, as it was already set in motion, they will simply force the humans back to allow this to happen. And a massive fleet was assembled. This fleet, though not many of them were known as war fleets, were assembled, and they figured they would simply attack the humans with strength of numbers. They had enough large cannons, large missiles, and everything of that nature to take out the humans. However, they realized that they had to make sure that they had enough to overwhelm the humans. They didn't want them getting too close and ram into their ships again. They already knew what the humans would do if they were able to get on board. It was at this point that the humans must have picked up their signal as they were getting close, as human ships began to show up one right after another, coming out of FTL just inside their own borders. The Council of Five fleet did not give any message except for one. It told the humans to stand down and let them come through, or they will be destroyed. The humans simply came back with a phrase that apparently is in one of their old dialects, Malan Labe. To this day, we have not figured out what it means. However, the Council of Ships had realized it was a line of defiance, as the ships had not stood down or retreated, but instead were powering up. They believed the humans were about to charge in and try to ram them, so the fleet decided to push through as even more human ships continued to trickle in. As they got close, several hundred kilometers, the human ships began to flash all different types of colors. It was only then that the council ships realized that they might have screwed up a little. Many projectiles, the size of small vessels, would crash into the side of their dreadnoughts. Energy weapons streaked across. However, some were not powerful enough to cut clean through a ship, but enough to scorch the side and possibly melt away some of the armor. Right behind them were flying projectiles, missiles, and torpedoes as they crashed into the enemy ship. However, the enemy fleet was not unarmed, and they began to fire back in earnest as well. For a while, space itself had more moving projectiles in it than ever before, as energy weapons, point defense systems, torpedoes, railguns, and everything else fired out. It was also at this time that the humans released their swarm of what turned out to be drones, flying in, firing, and as soon as they got close, they would grab onto a ship and begin to cut through the hull, ripping holes in it and depressurizing in a section and making sure that the crew had to fight its way over and actually cut the drone off, shoot it off or something, which usually meant that there was even more damage as the drone itself would explode when destroyed. The council ships began to push even farther into human territory, and unfortunately the humans, realizing they were severely outgunned and extremely outnumbered, started to pull back. They all turned broadside for a moment, and in one surprisingly coordinated assault, fired every weapon on the side of their ships at the same time, right through the center of the group. Every single one of their missiles and torpedoes was fired out, and the ships turned and then jumped into FTL. The Council fleet, though severely damaged, was not broken. They moved on to the closest planet. This planet had already been seen by the survey ship and noticed that it was extremely rich in metal resources that the Council wanted. They didn't want to destroy this planet at all. However, to take this planet, they would have to remove the 1.7 billion humans that currently colonized it. As they circled the planet, they began to hit every major city from orbit to try and limit the amount of humans they would have to face on the ground. Using any type of weapon they had, short of nuclear weapons, they pummeled onto the cities, toppling massive buildings onto each other, and like a stack of dominoes, many of the large skyscrapers fell to the side. It wasn't long until they believed they had the planet completely subjugated, and they began to land their soldiers. The landing ships landed without much of a problem, as the Council ships had already taken out most of the defenses. It wasn't until the ships were on the ground that they realized something might be wrong. As the Council soldiers disembarked, there was a loud thunder in the distance, which was strange. This planet was not conducive to thunder. However, it was not long before they realized that was not thunder, as massive amounts of ordnance began to land on their landing ships. Their other ships on the way down tried to wave off their landing, and other missiles began to fire up from the ground. Where were they coming from? Off in the distance, they came in slamming into the ships, and the ships eventually slamming into the ground as their anti-grav motors could not keep up the punishment. Some of the main engines were hit, diving the ship nose first straight into the planet, crushing everyone on board. Anywhere from 1,500 to 2,000 of their own were crushed under the impact of landing on the planet, and landing being a nice word for crash. Those ships on the ground were being torn apart by projectiles falling from the sky, but it was not from ships. No, it was from cannons on the ground. This was an odd concept to all of them. They would find out the humans called this artillery, or a good old-fashioned fuck you, as they came down more and more. Not only did they hit him with armor-piercing shells, high explosive, but they also began to shift the fire down towards where the soldiers had disembarked, and they began to hit them with high explosive and an incendiary device they found out to be complete white phosphorus. They were shaked and baked all the way into the ground, and as they screamed in pain, they desperately tried to get away from the transports, and then they ran straight into something they didn't expect. Humans began to rise out of the rubble of the cities, Out of seemingly every nook and cranny, they would just shake off the rubble, come out with their weapons up, and begin to fire. The sound of projectiles piercing the atmosphere to the point where it was impossible for the Xenos to even talk to each other. They could not give out commands, as they could not yell to each other. The sounds of their energy weapons was a very light zing, and that's all. However, the human projectile weapons, especially one the humans called the shotgun, was almost deafening to many of them. A few of the Xenos simply dropped their weapons and covered their ears as the sound was so painful, and then the moment they realized that maybe they should take cover, another shot would fire, and metal bearings would slam into their bodies, ripping parts off. Some of the Xenos had tentacles that seemed to simply flinch and thrash all the way around, and it wasn't long until they were perforated by all sorts of projectiles. The council soldiers screamed into their radios, trying desperately to get some sort of support. As they began to bring down their air support, they realized very quickly that they had not taken out the humans in atmospheric fighters. These fighters came in well beyond visual range as ordnance began to fly into the formations, crashing projectiles into each of these aerospace fighters, and they all exploded a massive ball of fire. Many of them tumbling down as huge hunks of worthless metal that would crash into their own formations, making them scatter even worse. And then they saw the humans flying in fast, so fast that the aerospace fighters couldn't keep up. It was strange. How could they fly so fast? They had to use something other than straight thrust. The anti-gravity motors inside the aerospace fighters whined and cranked as they tried to bank and turn, but they couldn't keep up. The human fighters would simply turn their nose around, seemingly pivot in mid-air, and all of a sudden let loose with more projectiles cutting into the aerospace fighter, shutting down at least one or two of their grav motors and forcing an ejection before again that entire fighter plummeted to the ground, worthless hunk of metal crashing again into a ball of fire. If this wasn't bad enough, those on the ground saw their entire air support disappear as more artillery came down, seemingly right in between all the fighters. And then they were shocked to see something even worse. The council had sent armored vehicles, but the humans had armor as well. This armor rolled onto the battlefield from such a distance they were amazed that the humans began to fire that far out. Projectiles, bright red projectiles, flew out. It took several seconds for them to strike, but when they did, the explosion would rip the council army's armor up to pieces. Their armor was not designed for this. They were more transports than tanks, and they would find out when humans call for artillery or armor support. You better look out because they're coming to kill everything. Not only was the main gun firing, but every time the Xenos came close, the tanks would open up with a small caliber, full automatic weapon and cut into their formation like it was nothing. That's if they could get close. The humans on the ground didn't seem to care. They began to fight through everything. Anything the Xenos could come at them. It was explosives and energy weapons, but the humans just seemed to shrug them off. The explosions tossed them off to the side. Even those without armor seemed to fly through the air, bounce off something hard, land, and you thought it was down, and a few seconds later would get back up and almost smile at you as it let out some sort of war cry, screaming into the air, and then ran straight in. The humans didn't seem to give any sort of care whether they survived or not. Some, by the time they reached the front line, were missing part of their bodies. They were dripping that red crimson fluid out of them as they jumped on the closest council member soldier and began to beat them with anything they had. If they had anything sharp or pointy, they stabbed the council soldier apart, sometimes cutting its head clean off. If they had a weapon that could fire, they just put it to their soldier's face and fired, watching its head explode inside its helmet. They then realized that even if they found one beating one of their soldiers down, if they shot it, if they hit it, the human just would not stay down. It became a battle cry of the council soldiers. What does it take to kill you? As they continued to fire, emptying their own energy reserves into the humans. Those that were still in armored suits, the humans that is, would simply go through the energy weapons like it was nothing and begin to start tearing at the Xenos themselves. The Xenos had to pull one last card. They couldn't fire any more orbital bombardments without taking out their own people, so they sent down other types of ordnance. This ordnance came down about halfway and exploded in a massive cloud. The humans saw this and started almost panicking. The council armies realized that they were in their protective suits. They didn't have to worry, so they pressed the attack as the humans seemed to be scared of this. They all seemed to scuttle back into whatever holes they were as the cloud of gas began to settle. The Xenos cheered as they could hear injured humans screaming in pain, coughing, gagging, vomiting. They writhed in pain on the ground. They began to cover themselves with every piece of cloth they had, and they just seemed to slowly fade off. And the Xeno army held up their weapons and cheered, happy that they had finally found a way to kill the humans. They began to move forward, even as other humans tried to come into the battlefield from the side. They realized that they had taken the city. The council member soldiers pushed forward, and they believed that they had taken it. And then from the ashes, humans rose again, their faces covered in bandages as their eyes were bleeding that same red liquid. From their mouths, all sorts of vile things came out, yellow, green, red liquids, parts of their own flesh as they coughed, and they came out screaming and in even more rage. They did not stop. It was looking on a pile of dead men rising from their graves to protect their planet. And it was at this time the council member soldiers broke. They all saw this and ran back to their transport. This scene played around the planet in at least 7 different cities. It was by the end of the next planetary rotation that every single one of the council soldiers that was still alive, that could still make it to a transport, got off that planet. Those outside the atmosphere had not done much better, as the human ships had simply jumped in from FTL, fired as much ordnance as they could, and before they could be fired upon, or before the ordnance could reach across to hit them, they would simply jump back into FTL and disappear again, leaving the ordnance in the air to strike at the council ships. The council ships had been taking a beating, and several had actually plummeted to the planet, getting caught in the magnetic field as they lost their propulsion systems. Evacuations were ordered, and all sorts of pods were littered across the entire planet. The council decided to cut their losses at this point. They had lost far too many ships and would have to pay out to all the personnel's family that they lost. They thought this was a complete and easy victory, but they pulled back. It would be almost a decade before they ever tried to speak with the humans again. This time with a bunch more apprehensions, as the humans had clearly geared up for more war. When the council ships approached the borders of human space, the humans seemed to expand it again as they reached out even further towards the council ships and telling them to stop and not enter human-controlled space. The council members this time spoke with humanity directly and told them they had canceled the project. Upon hearing this, the humans kind of looked at each other with a strange apprehension in their eyes. They didn't trust the Xenos. However, they respected their decision to stay away from human territory. And they told them that humans would not expand much further as they were still busy rebuilding. The Xenos seemed to take a little bit of pride in that they had actually managed to damage, even though they couldn't seem to kill the humans. After the negotiations, it became known around the galaxy not to travel into human territory and do not try to take over any of them. Why? Simply put, Humans are just too angry to die.